the most annoying thing is right, well, thank you for joining us. As is usual, we'll just wait a little while people connect in, but it's really great to see people piling in and lots of familiar names. Great to see you all. Joining from all around the world, I can see already. Oh, somebody's preempted me. No, it's good to do so, but it's New Hampshire. The first international hello comes from New Hampshire. That's fantastic. Hopefully it's a bit more, actually, I'm not sure the weather would be much better in New Hampshire than it is here, but we're getting lots of people join. Oh, San Francisco here, planning to move to London. Don't go to London, come to Yorkshire. It's God's own country. Yeah, Scotland is windy at the moment. That is true. So, oh, our speaker has returned, but we'll just give it another minute or so. And while you're clicking in, of course you like, oh, Melbourne. I don't know, Melbourne either has a massive population or we just have some very dedicated followers from Melbourne. Right, well, as people are still connecting in, I would just like to welcome you all to the latest Society for Church Archaeology lecture. As you know, these lectures are free and we welcome you to join us, but we'd always encourage you to join the Society for Church Archaeology because without our members, we can't sustain and put on these activities. I would just like to flag up to any of you who may not have seen this, that we have our conference coming up in September. Now, I know September seems like a far, far away place, but we are asking for contributions to our conference. It'll be held virtually. Hopefully it'll be our last virtual conference, but we would like to invite contributions on the topic of international perspectives to church archaeology, because we thought as we were going to do it online, we might utilize that sort of medium as a way of getting people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to come and speak to one of our conferences. So if you check the website, there are details there about how to express your interest in participating. So, I always make this mistake of looking at the chat box and trying to speak at the same time. I think without any further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Dr. Duncan Wright, who is also in God's own country of Lincolnshire as well, actually not very far from where I am sat here. Duncan is a lecturer in medieval archaeology at the School of Classics, History and Archaeology at the fine University of Newcastle. And he will be known to some of you, well, many of you, I suspect, as a lecturer who specializes in medieval settlement and landscape archaeology. Tonight, he's going to talk on the topic of the greedy comers to the waste, Guthlac and the archaeology of Anchor Church Field in Crowland. And I have to say, I expressed a slight interest in this, and I know he's already going to flag this up, but this may be something that we have been working on together, not that I'm going to be watching every single word. Or anything like that. But without any further ado, welcome, Duncan. And if you would like to share your screen and tell us all about Crowland.
Of course, thank you, Hugh. Can you just let me know that you can see that?
Yes, that's fine.
Lovely, thank you, Rob. Thanks very much, Hugh. It's lovely to have such an introduction, such a polite introduction. This is a collaborative project. I'll talk about that in a second. It's just a pleasure to speak to the Society for Church Archaeology, a society I know very well. Yeah, and that does great work. This talk tonight is a summary of work last summer, led by myself and Hugh. I'm really keen not to turn it into a series of sort of holiday snaps of our excavation, however. I really want to talk more broadly about what we think we found, and its significance for the early medieval church, and I think also early medieval monasticism in particular, and what we mean by sort of church communities in, you know, a really early and important phase of the English church in the 7th and 8th centuries. As Hugh has said, this is very much a collaboration between myself and Hugh. It's a site that we've both been interested in for a very long time. So I suppose it's just worth saying that I have the privilege, the honour of sharing our results today, but it really is a joint effort, and a joint effort collaboration between Newcastle University, where I'm based, and the University of Sheffield as well, where Hugh is based. Now, for those of you who don't know where Crowland is, best point of reference, I think, for many people would be that it's quite close to Peterborough. It's on the edge of the Fens, and would have had that location in the historic period in which we're interested in tonight, so the early medieval period, and later too. So located slightly north of Peterborough and also to the east. I think a more sort of insightful map, if you like, is this one here, which is a topographic map. The blue here showing the levels at about 0 to 5 metre above sea level, and gives a real impression of this landscape, probably how it looked in the early medieval period. We have Peterborough located to the west there, very important early medieval monastery, as you'll be aware. And also this map in many ways sort of encapsulates a political geography to some extent. The Fens was not deserted by any stretch, and we have important political groupings throughout the 6th and 7th centuries in the middle of the Fens. But it is worth noting that those two sort of green areas, the left and the right of the screen there, do develop as the two powerhouses politically of Mercia to the west, and then the kingdom of the East Angles to the east as well. So you could say in some ways that the Fens is a liminal zone. I think the work of people like Susan Westhausen has really helped to amplify and contest that to some extent, actually a very exploited landscape through the period. But there's no doubt that to some extent there is, the two important kingdoms do sort of arrange themselves either side of this landscape. Just for reference again, Crowland is located, you can't really get the sense of this Fen-edge location here. It looks like it's in the drink here somewhat, but it's actually on the edge of the habitable land to the west. This is shown a bit more, I think, insightfully here in this geology map. This is a modern geology map. There's a bit of debate actually whether Crowland is an island or a peninsula in this period, but it's certainly a salient point jutting out into the Fens at the time at which we're interested. Now, Crowland itself today is probably best known for this wonderful building here. This is Crowland Abbey. It does have its origins in a much earlier medieval period. It now serves as the parish church. It occupies the north aisle of a much larger structure, elements of which have been deserted throughout its history. But the reason that Crowland Abbey is here, and the reason that our interest, that Hugh and I's interest started at Crowland, lies much earlier, and that's associated with an individual called Guthlac. Many of you will be aware of Guthlac, aware of his story, but for those of you who aren't, I thought I'd just give a very brief introduction to his story, and then I'll talk about the site and what we think we've got. So Guthlac in Crowland, the most important thing to take away with the Guthlac story and how it relates to this part of the world is that Guthlac is a person of nobility. He's born in the 7th century into a Mercian noble family, and he becomes a hermit later in life. And he chooses Crowland, what's called the island of Crowland, by his biographer. And his biographer is just as important in this story, in that an individual called Felix, probably writing a generation or so after Guthlac's death, is the reason that we know so much about him. he's got a remarkably detailed life, for the period especially. It really is a unique document. And Felix details sort of Guthlac's progression, and he says about his life at Crowland and his life as a hermit that he occupies a mound built of clods of earth, which greedy comers to the waste had dug open. This in itself is fascinating. I could talk at length on this alone, but this appears to be discussing a barrow, probably a prehistoric barrow, some description, and also the process of grave robbing. So it's a very important reference in the 8th century to the acknowledgement of grave robbing of these features. And he says he builds his hermitage in a sort of a cistern as well, which is a bit of an enigmatic term. I'll talk about perhaps a little bit later. And essentially he lives a life of penance. Felix tells us that whilst many noble people come and visit him, and he's worthy of veneration in his lifetime, he's living a very basic lifestyle, drinking bread and water, involved in prayer. And then he dies about 15 years later in the 8th century. That's the kind of overview of his life. The early part of his life, obviously, for our story in Crowland is less important, but like many saints of this period, he is born into nobility. He becomes a warrior for 9 years. He then goes to Repton to become a monk. It's quite interesting, actually, that the reasons behind Guthlac's entry into the church and then his sort of life as a hermit have often, also by Felix, are cited as one of sort of religious devotion or religious zeal. There is a hypothesis that I think has some legs, that he may actually be exiled or be undertaking a process of self-exile, if you like. He may be involved with a murder and is in some way then forced, firstly to become a monk at Repton and then go further and become a hermit. As I said, around 700, he becomes a hermit at Crowland, and then he dies on the island and is buried at Crowland, importantly by his sister Pega, who plays a very, very central role, not just to the immediate aftermath of Guthlac's death, but also to his later veneration. And it's really the later veneration of Guthlac's tomb that we see the Abbey of Crowland growing up and becoming very wealthy throughout the medieval period. I'm not going to dwell too much upon the kind of posthumous life, if you like, of Guthlac, but it's very important to stress that, as I said, Pega's role in this, but also some of the citations to the architecture that may be encountered on Crowland, because I think it has relevance to our site. First of all, we're told by Felix that Guthlac is interred in his own oratory. After a year, however, it's found that Guthlac's body is incorrupt by Pega herself, and therefore that is evidence of his sainthood. He is moved as a consequence of that to a certain monument. This appears to be an above ground sarcophagus, perhaps in almost a Frankish style of building sarcophagi above the ground. It's absolutely possible, and again I'll talk about this later, that we're looking at more than one site of veneration, because the text also says that his empty coffin becomes a ritual focus as well as this new certain monument. We can't be sure whether that coffin's yards away or literally sort of kilometers away, to be honest. But there's a sort of a note of caution, a pinch of salt here, perhaps, that we shouldn't look too much into Felix giving us a verbatim account of what happened. But I think it's insightful to look at what he says more broadly is happening with Guthlac's veneration. We learn that the Ethelbald, this is the generation or so after Guthlac has died. Ethelbald did know Guthlac and met him, that he built wonderful structures and ornamentations. This could be a church, it may be other things. Later sources suggest that an earlier wooden oratory, maybe dating to Guthlac's original time, is then replaced by a stone church. And we also learned that another church, perhaps, is built in the 10th century. But lots of these sources, again, are problematic, and those of you who are really interested in church archaeology will often know that a citation to a church in a medieval document is rarely clear enough to tell us whether this is a new build or one that's just being replaced or refurnished. So it could be a de novo site. We just cannot be sure. So Guthlac's life is hugely important, but I think just as important, what I'm trying to emphasize is his posthumous veneration and what happens to him, his body, and his celebration, if you like, afterwards. In that context, it's important to remember, I think, that in terms of early medieval monasticism, monasteries are not seen necessarily as single locations. As those of you who have got National Trust memberships or English Heritage memberships will turn up to Fountains or Rievaulx Abbey and go to the abbey site. This may not have been the case in earlier periods. It's probably almost certain in many cases that the monastery is seen as much more extensive. They may occupy, certainly in the early medieval period, islands and peninsulas, and the whole landform, the whole area, indeed even the more extensive area, even the abbey lands might have been seen as the monastery. And David Stocker's image here is quite insightful for that. Those black dots that you can see are actually the locations of 12th century boundary markers. Now, these delimit the boundary of the 12th century Crowland Abbey and are probably delineating the abbey's owned reclaimed lands at that period. So we can imagine that actually in the early medieval period around Guthlac's time, whereas we wouldn't have had quite as much reclaimed land, that the abbey was seen as the entire island itself. And as time has developed and as more land is reclaimed, you can see this sort of pushing outwards, and that's what those boundary stones are doing, sort of expressing the limits of the abbey. So when we think of Crowland, we shouldn't necessarily think of one site in this period, and I think Felix may be alluding to that, multiple sites. And actually, I think this is really important for our story and our excavations over the last summer. So we do have, obviously, the site of the later medieval abbey. I'll talk briefly about that. That has been suggested as an important location for some of this activity in Guthlac's life. But the focus of the discussion this evening and where we excavated is some way out of the town now. It's further east, and it's interestingly probably in the last sort of habitable part of Crowland Island to the east, and it's known perhaps suggestively as Anchor Church Field. Interesting name, Anchor there, may relate to its use by anchorites or by hermits in a historic period. So the tradition, one of the traditions certainly locally, is that actually Crowland Abbey, the later abbey, is the site of Guthlac's hermitage and his veneration afterwards, and essentially that is why the abbey is there. This was known certainly by William Stukeley's time. He writes about there being sort of a shabby shack at the sort of the western southern ends of the church, and this seems to be, he says, Guthlac's original oratory. We can't be sure of the nature of this thing and whether it is a much later creation. Of course, this would have been a focus for pilgrimage, and it will be very much in the interest of the church in the later medieval period that this is literally the site of Guthlac's oratories and cells. And so some attempt has been made to sort of verify that. There was an excavation in 1908, which is only recorded in the Times. I've had real trouble finding any more evidence of this work, and so if anyone knows anything more about this, I'd love to hear from you, as I'm sure Hugh would as well. Essentially, that they claim to have found occupation to Guthlac's time, but it's far from conclusive. They do encounter Roman tile, which in itself is important, but essentially they're claiming that they found a layer underneath the later medieval church, which is sort of devoid of human remains, and this must be the Guthlac horizon, for want of a better term. Certainly not a compelling case, but it's certainly been suggested that perhaps a point of focus, and indeed maybe Guthlac's cell, is located underneath the later abbey. A second contender, if not for Guthlac cell, certainly for early activity and early activity dated to Guthlac's time, is our site, this site here at Anchor Church Field, which Stukely as well also knew about. He writes in the later 18th century about this site. He didn't know it when he was younger. Of course, Stukely himself is a yellow belly. He's from Lincolnshire. And so he's aware of Crowland. He visits several times in his life. And he draws this rather curious sketch of the site as well. The actual foreground, you and I have thought long and hard about this sort of sketch, and you'll see later. First of all, he's kind of foreshortened the perspective quite significantly here. But actually, the foreground components, the kind of the foundations you can see in the foreground art seem to be relatively accurate. He's turned the pitch around somewhat as well, and brought the abbey far closer. But yeah, he does recognise that this site seems to be one of historic interest. He draws it and calls it the Anchorite cell. And interestingly, he also gives this account. Really frustrating, my Zoom is covering the little panel at the top there, but he essentially says, further east than the abbey is a site called Anchor Church Field. It was the cell of Pega. So Stukely thinks this is the associated with Guthlac's sister. While Guthlac lived, she then moved elsewhere. But interestingly, he also says that this is a later location of an academy of monks, of learned men in Joffre's time, which is probably Geoffrey of Orleans, which is the 12th century. So he's saying that this is occupied, or certainly the popular belief at the time in the 18th century is this is occupied by cells later on, by a cell of learned men, but also that it has a pre-conquest association too. So real interest here, and a site that's clearly been recognised for a long time as being of interest. Interesting, Stukely also says that in his childhood, when he was younger, this was a site of a domestic residence. So it had changed its function from being one dedicated for religious purposes, and was then occupied as a normal house, essentially. He also mentions that there's one individual who goes to the site every Sunday and still worships on the site. I mean, who this is, we're not entirely sure, but a local eccentric. Interesting, is this is some sort of social memory of the previous veneration of the site. Later work than Stukely's sort of observations was undertaken by Canon Moore, an individual who is essentially just watching some workmen in the later 19th century take high quality Barnack stone away from this church, this site, at Anchor Church Field. Again, he's aware of the Guthlac association. He calls this Guthlac cell, and he draws this rather curious plan. He draws a kind of a multi-celled structure at the western end with what look like foundations extending to the east. And he says that over 2 tons of this really high quality limestone, this Barnack stone, are carted away by the men whilst he watches them do it. Now, this is quite a useful plan in many ways. We've got important correctives to make to this plan, Hugh and I, but it certainly kind of gave us a sense of a very substantial building being on the site, and actually kind of contextualizes the remains that we had and that we encountered this summer. Far more recent work has also been undertaken at Anchor Church Field, and you can still see on Google Earth the images and some of the archaeology that appears to be extant even today. That building, that multi-celled building that Stukely draws in the 18th century, and indeed that Canon Moore seems to sketch as well, is clearly visible on aerial photographs. We then have what looks like a circular feature in the middle of the screen here, just following the mouse around here. We're not entirely sure what that is. It's been suggested that this might be a prehistoric monument, maybe a barrow, and there are others in this sort of finger of land on Crowland Island. We also have this really substantial enclosure ditch as well, this circular thing tracing round as well. So clearly a really busy and potentially multi-phase site that has been explored, as I said, by other individuals before Hugh and I. For example, in 2002, English Heritage undertook a geophysical survey, with earth resistance in particular, giving us some really interesting anomalies. Picked up another potential barrow further to the west from our site, but also a square feature, that building clearly visible as well as other sort of linear anomalies too. That was followed in 2004 by some evaluation trenching by Archaeological Project Services, who identified a range of different archaeological evidence. They clipped the edge of that very distinctive multi-cell building and found the foundations of that, but found essentially material dating from the sort of prehistoric period right up to the post-medieval period. So before we'd even started our work this summer at Anchor Churchfield, we had the potential here for a real range of different archaeology. We had flint scatters, for example, found by the evaluation trenching. At one point, we thought that the building that we saw might be an aisle building, but certainly lots of tesserae were identified before our work. We have that early medieval association, whether that is to with Guthlac, Pega, neither of them, or something in between. There's certainly seems to be an early medieval association, but also a later association that's mostly picked up by Stukely in saying that it's a cottage on the site, but also that it's associated with a later chapel and maybe a school as well. So, in August 2021, and coming out of lockdown restrictions and facing challenges in many respects, I think, Hugh and I took a team of supervisors as well as Newcastle students and University of Sheffield students to try and sort of ground truth and actually excavate comprehensively for the first time, or start excavating this really intriguing site at Anchor Churchfield. And the focus of that work of the summer was this multi-cell building. It was the obvious thing to go for. With our resources, we thought we could do a really good job of that in the 2 weeks that we had. Immediately on taking the topsoil off, it was just striking at how clear that central feature was. It was to some extent really sort of archaeology 101. We really got a good sense of its multi-celled nature, and it didn't take a huge amount of the topsoil to start seeing it. Now, in terms of the results, I'd like to actually introduce them to you sort of chronologically. So I'm not going to talk about that central building necessarily to start with, but instead that we did encounter, in terms of I suppose our initial interest in the early medieval period and the Guthlac story, we did encounter significant archaeological remains broadly dating to that period. That drone picture you can see there really contrasts with the one I showed you previously, in that you can see quite how dark a lot of this material is. This is really organic, rich, early medieval deposits that we started to encounter as we progressed through the stratigraphy over the fortnight. We did not identify firmly any features dating to the pre-conquest period, but we definitely got occupation horizons, including this wonderful bone comb. Steve Ashby was kind enough to date this for us. It's an Ashby type 12, he told us, dating to broadly the Middle Saxon period, extending to the Late Saxon period in the southeast. So seems to be dating to really a period of interest for us. We also encountered huge amounts of 6th, 7th century, 8th century ceramics, definitely Ipswich ware, which starts to be made in the 8th century. A very, very busy early medieval site. And I can't really stress how important that ceramic sequence is for us, especially this pre-conquest, the 8th century stuff in particular. It's notable quite how little ceramic you tend to get in this period. By the 10th and certainly the 11th century, we start to get industrialized pottery in England, much more widespread. However, before that period, ceramics are few and far between. So when you find couple of fragments of early medieval, you know, Ipswich ware, for example, 8th century stuff, that usually means that the site, you know, it's occupation, you know, there's sorts of different scales that we're working with here. And so just because of the lack of ceramics that we have, they're really diagnostic of activity in a way that they're not in different periods. This is not manuring, this is clearly dense activity in the pre-conquest period. In addition to our early medieval finds, and some of those dating to, if you like, the Guthlac phase, I say that, you know, very guardedly, we did find significant amounts of ceramic building material, Roman ceramic building material. And you can see Sam and Ches, two of our supervisors there, helping to excavate with the students some of this Roman tesserae. Now, the actual structure itself, that's what it looked like when we uncovered it. As I said, really great archaeology to teach because it's just so visible, it's just there, you know, and it can be quite for want of a better term, quite a simple exercise to investigate this thing and to start dating it and make sense of it. And what we've had and what we're pretty happy with in terms of the interpretation is that actually this is not the site of a chapel or a cell as we thought it might be. Certainly from Stukely's writings and Canon Moore, he draws this multi-cell building as Guthlac's cell. But actually the orientation should have given us the clue, but this seems to be a tripartite medieval hall. It's orientated north-south, that's the big clue. And it's divided into these big three sections with almost an extension behind Ches, you can see there. We had substantial 1 meter wide foundations of really, really compact clay. We did encounter some of that high quality building stone, but only tiny bits of that Barnack stone. It just shows quite how effectively that stone had been removed from this structure in the 19th century. However, this is a really badly truncated feature. We only got the very, very last slither of it. And it's clear that it had been really badly, I think, damaged over the years, certainly the last 100 or so years. I think agriculture would have had a lot to do with that. So interpreting it very closely will be a challenge. And one of the things you look for a tripartite hall is what might be the top end, if you like, the high status end in terms of its typical arrangement. You'd have a high status chamber at one end, you'd have your main hall, and then a lower end with a buttery and a pantry, perhaps a kitchen as well. Because of the truncated nature of the site, that is going to be difficult to reconcile, and actually trying to piece that together will be a challenge. So we may be able to do that, but certainly it will be difficult because of the preservation conditions. But we're relatively happy, Hugh and myself, that we have this tripartite hall on the site, and we think this probably dates to the you know, later 11th century or 12th century, partly based on the ceramics. Doesn't seem to be occupied in the 13th century. Interestingly enough, the geophysics gives us a bit of a clue that the structure may well be related to that large square enclosure as well. It sits very neatly right in the middle of it. So it's probable that in some way these two things are related. One of our goals for this summer actually will be to put a slot through this anomaly and try and date it more firmly. The Archaeology Project Services actually did dig this feature. They did find a bit of late Saxon pottery in it, which is interesting, but dating that really closely will be important, whether we can associate it with this tripartite hall. So a really important outcome, I think, for the site and its use in the medieval period. Going sort of back to our finds, if you like, and actually flipping back to a slightly earlier period. I will come full circle, so please be patient with me. Our finds are obviously really important. They help date the different phases of occupation, but it's really notable quite how dense the amount of ceramic building material that we encountered. And coming out of the ground, we thought a lot of this looked Roman, and sure enough, our early post-excavation work, and I should stress that many of our observations are at this stage, without full post-excavation processing, so they are taken with a wee bit of a pinch of salt, but we had huge amounts essentially of Roman building material. We had what looked like parts of tessellated floor. There seemed to be huge amounts of tesserae coming up, more white than the sort of the red clay ones we can see there. We seem to have essentially a 2/3 to 1/3 ratio there, much of which we can't be sure, but as I said, seems to be Roman flooring. Other components of that within it, though, seem to be actually reused Roman roof tile, bits of tegula, clearly distinctive by its flanges, tegula recycled as tesserae as well. So we seem to have Roman material on the site. And obviously the obvious question, the sort of pressing question is this site Roman? Well, other Roman finds, in addition to the tesserae, were also found. Lots of Roman brick, but more than that, lots of Roman box flue as well. This really distinctive type of tile would have been used as these box flues, as you can see, part of the hypercourse system, not the actual underground heating the cells, but actually probably built into the walls. And these were where hot air would have been pumped up through the building to keep the building warm. We had significant quantities of this as well. So really rather interesting. So is this site Roman? Do we have maybe a reuse of a Roman site in the early medieval period and later? Well, actually, I don't think so. This is not a Roman site. Our pottery sequence is comprehensively 7th century to about the year 1200. Now, this is very, very interesting. It's something that's very important. But what it's not is a Roman site. On a site where you've got flooring, where you have box flue, and essentially a hypercourse system, this should be at least a middling, if not a high status Roman site, where you would expect significant quantities of pottery, significant quantities at least of grey wares, of your higher status wares, your samey wares certainly. Not assured of it. The only evidence of Roman activity apart from that CBM was we had one piece of mortarium, one element of mortarium, which seemed to be kicking around in the plough soil as well. It had been badly eroded. Our ceramic sequence is 7th century to 1200. The Roman material there has almost certainly been taken from elsewhere and brought to our site. And that is really significant for how we understand the use of the site in the medieval period. Recycling of Roman material, and I will come full circle back to Anchor Churchfield and our findings, trust me, is really distinctive of some sites in the early medieval period. It's very, very distinctive, particularly of really high status sites, often associated with churches. The work of Gabor Thomas, who's written a very good paper on Roman reuse, especially related to the sites in Kent that he's excavated and reanalyzed, including that at Dover, where his reinterpretation of excavations within the town of Dover have more firmly associated an opus signinum floor, that is components of reused Roman material, bits of Roman tile fused with dust and mortar, being used in early medieval buildings, probably buildings dating to the 6th and 7th centuries, high status halls in this case. Likewise, his excavations at Lyminge saw Roman flooring being reused as packing material. And also sort of flint aggregates found in close association with some of the hulls, which is really interesting too. The aggregate would have been sort of, in the case of these types of floors, you would have got like a flint foundation, a flint core, over which this opus signinum, which would have been tile mixed with mortar, would have been laid like a sheen on top, if you like, to give this really impressive multicolored white and pink floor effect. It's interesting that the aggregate was found in such close association at Lyminge to the halls here, which suggests the actual construction of this flooring is probably taking place in real close proximity. This is not being undertaken elsewhere in a specialist workshop necessarily, but actually the reuse of the floor, the Roman floor in these high status buildings, is actually taking place really close to the site, which is significant for us. It's interesting that this sort of opus signinum flooring, I'm not saying necessarily that was what we've got at Crowland, we just got this Roman reuse. It seems to be associated quite closely with early monastic context, very early churches in England, by which I mean, you know, in the 7th century, not the ones dating to the Romano-British period or earlier. Example of this include Glastonbury in Somerset, Reculver, and Wearmouth Jarrow all have evidence of, I think very helpfully, what Gabor calls them is pseudo opus signinum floors. So, you know, not necessarily the real deal and full Roman floors, but certainly they're a drive to remaking some of this Roman material, and the Roman reuse of material in early medieval churches is relatively well established. And I think that's what we might have at Crowland as well. So I think that the glaring question remains for me to answer in the last 5 minutes or so is do we have a church at Anchor Church Field? Do we have an early medieval church, or indeed a sequence of churches at Anchor Church Field? I think we do, or certainly there's a very high chance that we do, and I hope that we can find out this summer. And this is going to leave you on a wee bit of a cliffhanger to finish. It's quite useful to revisit Canon Moore's plan and try and sort of work out what might be happening here. We were relatively happy halfway through that we had identified this part of Canon Moore's original plan that he thought was a singular structure. We were having trouble, though, reconciling that with the other section, these sort of, you know, these what look like foundations, interconnected foundations emanating from the tripartite hall. We did realise, though, over the course of last year's excavation, that this is actually a conflation, it's a confusion. What we do have here is a tripartite hall, but actually Canon Moore has conflated these two elements into one building. Instead, on the site, we have two buildings. And the bit on the right that you can see is actually a second structure. What that structure might be is every chance that it may well be an early medieval church, or, as I said, a series of churches. So what kind of more might have happened, and what might have happened in the 19th century, we assume that he sat on, you know, the side of the road and watched the workmen take the material out over the course of, you know, a handful of days. It's more likely that he visited episodically, that he saw some of the material being, you know, drawn out from the tripartite hall. He then came back, you know, a week or two later and planned the other elements and conflated the two into a single building. And that's where that confusion has emerged. We think we have identified that second structure. It's clearly not emanating and not closely or directly associated with our tripartite hall. The aerial just gives you the suggestions there of stone footings. They're much clearer to see in excavation. We seem to have stone piers here of a building emanating west-east. A bit more clearly you can see it there, a stone footing. We didn't excavate this nearly comprehensively. We recognised quite early on that this would take another season's work, so we're going to revisit. But we do have foundations, and with the eye of faith, you can see the start of a small wall projecting to the east as well. This had been encountered, these stone piers, or at least one of them, had been encountered in earlier phases of work by Archaeology Project Services in this case. And again, this really distinctively looks like a pier foundation of a structure on the site. Revisiting one of the aerial photographs that we used, it's quite clear to see that second structure on the site. We have our tripartite hall, you can see here, but you can just start to see what look like 6 footings of a building orientated west-east. It's interesting that these buildings do not intercut. It does suggest that certainly they were around the same time. You know, they're not truncating each other, and they might be coterminous, at least some of their phases certainly might be. So we have the potential for a second structure at Anchor Church Field. And given the finds from this summer, that really distinctive sequence of Roman CBM, but lacking a Roman occupation. I think there's every chance that this is a high status early medieval building, perhaps even a church. Okay then, so I've whittled on for about 45 minutes. So what do we have in summary before I can field potentially some of your questions? Well, I've not even talked about some of the prehistoric stuff we encountered, which itself was really, really interesting, but forgive me, as a pressurous time in trying to give you some of the medieval church headlines, if you like. But we've clearly got a very complex multi-period site, and our occupation sequence, dating from the Mesolithic, with actually Mesolithic occupation identified through flint scatters, through to the post-medieval. We have our post-conquest hull, and that would have been a good outcome, I think, from any given summer. But that alone, was a real, we're really happy with that outcome. We think it's located with its own enclosure. We hope to ground truth that this summer. We do have evidence, and forgive the phrase, of this Guthlac period occupation, but no structures at this stage. Last summer, we didn't identify anything that we could confidently associate with the pre-conquest period in terms of structural evidence. We have this dense Roman ceramic building material, and just to give you a sort of a percentage, or in terms of quantities, I think we got 98 kilos of CBM from the site last summer. 97 kilos of that is Roman, or probably Roman. So 99% of the CBM we've got, the ceramic building material, is Roman building material, but not Roman occupation. And that is suggested by our ceramic sequence. So this is Roman spolia, it's reused Roman material from another site. We seem to have this second structure. We now know that it's orientated west-east. It seems to be constructed with stone piers and has walls interconnecting them. That clearly is the focus of our work next summer. Now, I'm not going to overinterpret how this ties into the Guthlac story. It's far too early a stage. A note of caution also to what I said at the start of the lecture, in that we need to be aware of the polyfocal nature of early church communities, that the abbey, the monastery, and indeed the church community would have probably occupied the entire island. Indeed, Felix's life does talk about that, talks about actually Guthlac, people coming to visit Guthlac, and they have to ring a bell because he's elsewhere on the island. So, there are different landing places, perhaps different places of veneration, maybe ones associated with Pega as well, and we need to be aware of that and not overinterpret. But I hope those initial findings, if you like, and they are only initial findings of our work last summer, have been of interest. It is really important that I give acknowledgements, of course, firstly to my co-director Hugh, but also to really important individuals who literally could not have, we couldn't have done our work without their help. John and Mark Beacon, who farmed the land, and Matthew Alcock in particular of Crowland Caravans and Camping, who have been more than helpful, and have made our work possible by helping us at every possible stage. Crowland Abbey have been supportive and taken an interest, as have the Crowland community, a really positive reaction from everybody involved, as well as supervisors and students who did all the digging. Myself and Hugh are usually doing far more boring things than the actual excavation, and really it's the supervisors and students who have produced those results that I've been able to share tonight. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Duncan. If you downsize your PowerPoint.
Sure.
And then, fantastic.
Stop sharing.
Ah, perfect. Well, I don't know what to say, really. Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's the right answer.
Really fascinating talk, and do chip in if you have a question.
I should probably say, Hugh, this is because we've been doing some of the post-text literally 2 weeks ago. It's some of the first time that we've already discussed some of the results of this as well. So, don't
tell me you're about to jump the shark and
no, but it's one of those things that when you're on the site, you anticipate what's happening as it's coming out, but you really don't know until you get back to the lab and start to really crunch the finds, really. So it seems to be doing the right things that we thought, I think.
Well, I mean, I think this is what's really interesting, and I'm trying to sort of distance myself from the project. But what's really interesting about when you're getting really fresh, out of the ground results is that inevitably interpretations will change, because it's an ongoing process. It's a dialogue. You know, we wait for specialist input and that sort of thing. But I think you've outlined some really potentially interesting sort of scenarios about what's going on at the Anchor Church Field. So I guess I don't know. I'm waiting for Rob to see if anyone's got a question. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask a very deep, probing one, which I would have to have vested interest in.
Yeah, we've got one question. Yes, sorry, we've got one. Oh no, here they all come now.
I mean, otherwise it'll turn into an evening with Hugh and Duncan, which I don't think anyone really wants.
Well, I was about to say it'd be entirely inappropriate for me to ask some questions. So let's go, Rob. Let's go.
Okay, fantastic. Right, good question to start us off with here. Are there any known Roman sites nearby where the fragments might have come from?
That's a very excellent question. Previously, it's been suggested that the material, the Roman material encountered on the site in work previous to us may have come from Water Newton, which is some distance away. It's a substantial Roman town on the other side of Peterborough, essentially slightly north of Peterborough. That's a possibility, but there are closer Roman sites that are known. I think there's a suggestion of a villa, the name of which I'm not entirely sure, that's slightly, I think it's a couple of kilometres to the east of our site. Certainly, it's a busy Roman landscape. Actually, trying to identify the Roman site where this stuff is taken from, I think might be difficult. But it's Water Newton has been suggested, but I would have thought the quality of the tessa is quite interesting. This is clearly not a really high end, perfectly massively high status tessellated floor. It seems to be a tessellated floor. Clearly that is high status of a kind, but not the kind of that we saw on sort of Digging for Britain and that sort of that Leicestershire mosaic that we saw. We're not. They're actually quite. This is a very basic way of viewing it, and you can tell I'm not a Romanist, but they're quite chunky bits, and this is quite probably a used Roman floor. So we can't be entirely sure. Water Newton's been suggested, but I think there are other contenders closer to the site.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Another question is nearby. So you've got Crowland Abbey. What was the current state of church life, and what was the building like there at the time?
I think it's impossible to know. I think that excavation by that's reported in the Times, certainly, presumably this is in sort of the Guthlac period. Because we don't have, well, I've not been able to find an excavation record and try and piece it together. It's interesting that they encounter what they call Roman material. So maybe there's a contender that actually there's a Roman site located in the middle of the island, where essentially where Crowland now is, and where the abbey is. So that could be a contender. In short, we really don't know, and I think what we need to be alive to in the project is that this nascent sort of stage of, I'm not even going to call it monasticism, these early stages of church communities have great fluidity. Often they don't have great archaeology and they're really hard to find. But we immediately sort of start looking for the components of more celebrated but often later sites. So a series of churches and workshops arranged X, Y, and Z. But actually, in the 7th, early 8th centuries, this might have been far more fluid. There's a sense here, and it has been commented on before, that only by the 10th century a monastic community is founded, and that goes before, and that it sort of celebrates and venerates Guthlac is actually sort of a freelance movement, and they're much less well organized, and that may well be the case. So the archaeology of that might be relatively unknown, and I think that's what makes the site really interesting.
Fantastic. Hugh, if you've got your pressing question, it'd be a good chance to hear that.
Oh, don't put me on the spot.
You're a plant.
Oh dear, I didn't have one ready. are you likely to find the mortal remains of Guthlac next year, or this year, I guess?
Well, it'd be really interesting, wouldn't it? That would be great. So I had a comment saying that substantial reuse of, sorry, I will answer your question, Hugh, but reuse of raw material in Brixworth. I did actually have a Brixworth slide in there, but yeah, that's a very good point. Exactly right. The arcading, especially in Brixworth, is a Roman tile essentially. So yeah, an excellent point. But could we find the mortal remains of Guthlac? I mean, I think there's every possibility that we could find early churches associated with that, and what that looks like again is going to be really very, very interesting, I think. The fact that by 730, 740, there are wondrous structures being constructed suggests that there might be substantial remains dating to that period. And I think we were heartened, certainly, weren't we, by the encounter of that early medieval sequence in the early stages of the project, where you just don't find this stuff, as I said, kicking around the countryside unless you have places of dense occupation. So it could well be, and I think in terms of the veneration, again, the fact that our ceramic sequence drops off about 1200, where we seem to, this is very broad dating, we seem to have a shift of focus towards the abbey, is fascinating itself. And is there a question actually that the Pega association is in some way legitimizes the Guthlac association, so the Pega association with Anchor Church Field legitimizes the Guthlac association then with the later medieval abbey site, and that way there is a shift in the focus from our site to the abbey. That might well be the case, but yeah, if there's a church there, there's every chance that we have a interesting early stuff. That's as much as I'll say here.
That was a very unfair question. I know.
I know. Just I don't want to get too carried away.
No, absolutely. And it's your lecture, so I'm not going to go into anything. But there's some very interesting late 15th century references to what might be going on there as well.
Yeah, of course.
You didn't have time to touch on, but the monks of Crowland are told off by bishops for not maintaining things as they should be maintained and all that. So for some reason my chat box has frozen, Rob, so I can't see if there are any more questions, but are there any? No, but that's fantastic.
No,
Duncan has
just people saying it's one of their favorite lectures, which is always great to hear. So yeah, I'm really glad people enjoyed it.
No, fantastic. It's all brilliant. Well, if there are no further questions, we will thank our speaker, Dr. Duncan Wright, for giving an amazing talk about, some kind of site of something. Oh, I can see a hand going up from Joy Russer, but I don't.
It's a clap, I think.
Oh, it's a clap. Sorry. You can spot my vanity. You can spot. Oh dear, you're still recording as well. You can spot my vanity because I don't wear my glasses when I'm doing these Zoom things. So I can't see the difference between the symbols. Anyway, I'd like to thank our speaker for a really, really interesting talk, and thank you all for joining us. Please do join us next month when we have Dr. Alex McLean, and in my haste to get to the lecture, I forgot to write down what she's talking about. So Rob will...
It is medieval cross slabs of Northern England.
Fantastic. So that'll be a really fascinating one. And in the meantime, do check out the website if you're interested in our conference in September and if you wish to contribute. But otherwise, just to thank Duncan, Rob, and you all for attending. And we'll see you next time.